The 1960s were an age of cinematic experimentation, a decade when horror evolved from Gothic melodrama into something raw, psychological, and strangely beautiful. These weren't just movies, they were warnings, dreams, and obsessions projected in grain and shadow. Behind their low budgets and fading film stock, they captured a kind of terror that still feels uncomfortably, intimately real. Tonight, we return to that strange decade to uncover 10 essential cult classic horror films from the 1960s that you simply can't ignore. The end doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it walks. Terrence Fisher, the master behind some of Hammer's most iconic nightmares, directs The Earth Dies Screaming, a haunting relic of atomic age paranoia wrapped in eerie sci-fi minimalism. The film opens on an empty world, cars abandoned mid-journey, bodies frozen where they fell, and an eerie silence that feels almost deliberate. Willard Parker stars as Jeff Nolan, a survivor wandering through the ghostly remains of an English village, searching for life among the dead. The atmosphere is chilling in its simplicity. Fisher trades spectacle for stillness, building dread through absence, empty streets, motionless figures, and a sound design that lets silence do the screaming. The film plays out like a nightmare you can't wake from. Part invasion story, part ghostly dream of extinction. The survivors aren't heroes. They're just human, frightened, desperate, and distrustful of each other. As alien-controlled corpses begin to close in, the horror isn't just that the world has ended, it's that no one was worth saving in the first place. With its sparse dialogue and lingering silences, The Earth Dies Screaming feels more like a dirge than a disaster film, a grim, beautiful echo of the end of the world. It's proof that sometimes the scariest apocalypse isn't fire or brimstone, it's quiet. For some, death is a fear. For others, it's a profound obsession. Directed by Roger Corman and released in 1962, The Premature Burial is one of the crown jewels of the Edgar Allan Poe cycle. A gothic nightmare about fear itself, and the madness that follows when it becomes the only thing keeping you alive. Ray Milland stars as Guy Carell, a man utterly consumed by the terror of being buried alive, a fixation that festers into outright madness. Convinced that death will come too soon, and that no one will know he's still breathing, he constructs an elaborate mausoleum, complete with escape mechanisms and warning bells, a tomb built for a man who refuses to die quietly. Corman's direction is restrained yet feverish, building dread through space and color. Millen plays it straight, his dignity eroding scene by scene until he seems less like a man and more like a ghost rehearsing his own funeral. The beauty of The Premature Burial lies in its tension between reason and terror. Is Karen cursed or simply mad? Does the darkness outside his coffin even exist? It's gothic horror at its purest. Elegant, suffocating, and morbidly romantic. Proof that the deepest graves are the ones we dig inside our own minds. The sins of the past don't die. They rot until they claw their way back. Released in 1969 and directed by Gordon Hessler, The Oblong Box marked a shift in Gothic horror. A move from the candlelit castles of the early 60s towards something darker, bloodier, and more psychological. It reunites Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, two masters of the macabre, in a tale that blurs the line between vengeance, disease, and moral decay. Price plays Julian Markham, an aristocrat haunted by a family secret. His brother Edward, deformed and deranged after a voodoo curse in Africa, is being kept hidden and alive within the walls of their ancestral home. When Edward fakes his death and escapes, the story becomes a feverish nightmare of identity, guilt, and revenge. A coffin that should have stayed closed is opened, and with it, the sins of empire spill out into the streets of London. The film's colonial backstory adds an unexpected edge, hinting at guilt that runs deeper than family disgrace. This isn't just about a man hiding a monster, it's about civilization hiding its crimes. Christopher Lee's doctor, cold and pragmatic, becomes the film's conscience, a man who sees clearly but feels nothing. And Price, ever the tragic figure, gives Julian a haunted nobility, a man undone not by evil, but by the things he tried to bury. The Oblong Box stands as one of the most atmospheric of late 60s Gothic horrors, a bridge between Corman's brooding Poe adaptations and the more violent, introspective nightmares that would soon follow. Proof that when you lock away your sins, they never stay dead for long. Released in 1968 and directed by Vernon Sewell, Curse of the Crimson Altar is a heady collision of Gothic tradition and psychedelic excess, the last gasp of classic British horror before it slipped fully into the surreal. It opens with an invitation. A young man's disappearance draws his brother, played by Mark Eden, to a remote English estate known as Crackstead Lodge. There he finds decadence masquerading as civility, where the guests wear masks, whisper in riddles, and worship something far older than they admit. Presiding over it all is Boris Karloff in one of his final performances, and Christopher Lee as the chillingly composed host who may know more about the lodge's secrets than he lets on. But the film belongs to Barbara Steele, appearing in spectral form as Lavinia Morley, the green-skinned witch whose image dominates the film's dream sequences like a fever that won't break. Sewell directs with one foot in the Gothic and the other in the hallucinatory. It's less about story than sensation, a descent into a world where reason dissolves in incense. Curse of the Crimson Altar captures the exact moment horror stopped being about monsters and started being about atmosphere, about the things you feel rather than the things you see. It's elegant, strange, and a little hypnotic, proof that by the end of the 1960s, even witchcraft had started to swing. Nightmares Don't End When You Wake. Released in 1968 and directed by Ingmar Bergman, Hour of the Wolf isn't traditional horror. It's a descent into artistic madness, filmed with such intimacy and dread that it feels like being trapped inside someone else's nightmare. Max von Sydow plays Johann Borg, a tormented painter who retreats to a remote island with his wife Alma, portrayed by Liv Ullmann. He hopes to find peace. Instead, he finds visions, or perhaps memories, of grotesque figures that stalk him through the night. They leer, whisper, and press against the edges of reality until both he and the viewer begin to question what's real. Bergman calls this the hour between night and dawn, the hour when most people die, when sleep is deepest, when nightmares are most real. And that's exactly how it feels. The film moves like a fever, long silences, sudden bursts of madness, faces that change expression when the light flickers. Bergman doesn't tell a ghost story, he traps you inside one. What makes Hour of the Wolf so deeply unsettling is how personal it feels. It's a horror film stripped of monsters where the demons are internal and the terror comes from recognizing them. Johann's artistic obsession consumes him, while Alma watches helplessly, unsure if she's witnessing his breakdown or sharing in it. The imagery is unforgettable. A dinner party of ghoulish aristocrats, a child's corpse dragged from the water. Every scene feels symbolic, but every symbol cuts like glass. It's not horror for the body, it's horror for the soul. A film about creation, madness, and the fine line between genius and damnation. Proof that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what refuses to leave your mind. Released in 1960 and directed by Michael Powell, Peeping Tom was the film that nearly ended a legendary career, and decades later became recognized as one of the most important horror films ever made. At the time, it was scandalous. Critics called it obscene, vile, even evil. But today it stands as a chilling exploration of obsession, voyeurism, and the sickness that can grow behind the lens of a camera. Karl-Heinz Bohm stars as Mark Lewis, a quiet, polite young man who works as a focus puller in a London film studio. He spends his nights making his own films. Not of beauty, but of death. Mark murders women while filming their final moments, capturing their fear in the reflection of a mirror mounted on his camera. To him, it's not cruelty, it's art. Powell directs the story with a disturbing intimacy. Every frame forces us to question our own role as viewers, complicit in watching, craving, and dissecting what we shouldn't. Visually, the film is stunning. Lurid Technicolor contrasts with cold, clinical precision. London streets gleam like dreamscapes, and shadows stretch like accusations. Boom's performance is both tragic and terrifying, playing a man who doesn't understand where empathy ends and control begins. Peeping Tom was released the same year as Psycho, but where Hitchcock offered shocks, Powell offered self-reflection, and audiences weren't ready for it. It was too close to home, too revealing. Today, it's seen as a masterpiece, a film about the act of seeing itself, about the danger of turning fear into spectacle. It's less a slasher film than an autopsy of obsession, a story about the desperate hunger to look and the horror of what stares back. Proof that sometimes the true monster isn't in front of the camera, it's the one behind it. Released in 1961 and directed by Jack Clayton, The Innocents remains one of the most haunting ghost stories ever filmed, a masterclass in ambiguity, repression, and the slow suffocation of certainty. Based on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, it stars Deborah Kerr as Miss Giddens, a young governess hired to care for two orphaned children at a remote country estate. At first, everything seems idyllic, sun-drenched gardens, laughter echoing through empty halls. But beneath the beauty, something festers. The children behave strangely. Whispers drift through corridors. And in the distance by the lake, two figures appear, pale, watching, waiting. Clayton directs with extraordinary restraint, building dread through silence and suggestion. Every flicker of light, every echo of laughter feels loaded with meaning. The cinematography by Freddie Francis bathes the estate in eerie black and white, using depth of field to trap the viewer in Giddens' point of view. Half real, Half Imagined. Deborah Kerr delivers one of the finest performances in horror history. Her governess is fragile yet ferociously determined, convinced that the spirits of the dead servants have possessed the children. But the true horror is uncertainty, whether the haunting is real or the product of her own repressed desires and unraveling sanity. Are we watching ghosts or madness? The result is hypnotic, elegant, and unbearably tragic. The Innocence is the kind of horror that doesn't scream. It whispers, it lingers, it watches you back. Proof that the most terrifying hauntings are the ones that leave you unsure whether you were ever alone. Released in 1964 and directed by Masaki Kobayashi, Kwaidan is one of the most visually breathtaking horror films ever made, a haunting anthology that transforms Japanese ghost stories into pure cinematic poetry. The title means ghost story, but what Kobayashi creates is closer to a hallucination. Four tales of love, betrayal, and the supernatural, each unfolding with the patience of a nightmare that refuses to end. Every frame of Kwaidan looks painted. The skies shimmer with impossible colors. Snow falls like ash. The sets are dreamlike, abstract, and symbolic. More theater than realism. Among its four stories, two stand out as unforgettable. The Woman of the Snow, where a young woodcutter swears never to reveal the spirit who spared his life, until the truth costs him everything. And Hoichi the Earless, in which a blind musician is marked by ghosts who demand he play for the dead, his music binding him between the worlds of the living and the damned. Kobayashi's approach is hypnotic. No jump scares, no sudden violence, only slow, inexorable dread. The sound design hums with silence, and Toru Takemitsu's score feels like a haunting itself, part whisper, part wind. What makes Kwaidan endure isn't fear, but beauty. It's a film that finds horror in stillness, in memory, in the way the past refuses to let go. Every ghost here is bound not by anger, but by longing, a sadness that transcends death itself. It's long, meditative, and utterly mesmerizing. A film that proves horror doesn't need to startle you to haunt you forever. Some towns never forget, some memories never die. Released in 1964 and directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, 2000 Maniacs is a southern fried fever dream. Part splatter film, part revenge fantasy, and part carnival from hell. It opens innocently enough. Six unsuspecting travelers are lured off the highway into the small town of Pleasant Valley, a place that seems frozen in time. Confederate flags wave, brass bands play, and the smiling locals welcome their guests to the centennial celebration. But the town has a secret. It's not celebrating the past. It's reliving it. Pleasant Valley was destroyed by Union troops during the Civil War, and now its vengeful ghosts have returned to reenact their bloody retribution over and over again. Each tourist becomes a prop in the town's twisted festivities. Lewis, known as the godfather of gore, shoots the film like a drive-in nightmare. Garish colors, exaggerated acting, and practical effects that push 1960s boundaries. What it lacks in Polish, it makes up for in sheer audacity. Beneath the camp and chaos lies something genuinely disturbing, a nation haunted by its own history, unable to stop celebrating its bloodiest ghosts. The result is exploitation horror with a purpose. 2000 Maniacs doesn't just shock, it exposes. The smiling faces, the patriotic songs, the southern hospitality, all of it masking centuries of violence and revenge. It's loud, lurid, and impossible to forget. It's revenge made cinematic, echoing across generations who never learned how to bury the past. Madness runs in the family, sometimes literally. Directed by Jack Hill, Spider Baby 1968 is the perfect closing act for 1960s horror. A film that begins as black comedy, descends into madness, and somehow finds poetry in its decay. It stars Lon Chaney Jr. in one of his last and most haunting performances, playing Bruno, the loyal caretaker of the Merry family. A clan afflicted with a strange hereditary disease that causes them to regress mentally as they age. They live alone in a crumbling mansion, hidden from the world, where the children, Ralph, Virginia, and Elizabeth, play games that are anything but innocent. The setup feels familiar at first. Another haunted house, another family secret. But Spider Baby is something else entirely. It's part gothic horror, part dark fairy tale, and part grotesque satire of American normalcy. Jack Hill directs it with a mix of affection and anarchy, using low budgets and wild imagination to craft a film that feels like the Addams Family by way of a fever dream. Chaney brings heartbreaking humanity to Bruno, a man trapped between duty and guilt, trying to protect his children, even as their innocence curdles into something monstrous. Meanwhile, Sid Haig's unforgettable performance as Ralph, part child, part predator, blurs the line between horror and pity. What makes Spider Baby endure isn't just its shocks or its weirdness, it's the sadness that lingers underneath. Spider Baby feels like a farewell to classic monster cinema. Part eulogy, part rebirth. Beneath the absurdity lies sadness, a reflection on what happens when monsters grow old and the world forgets them. And there you have it. 10 haunting, hypnotic, and wildly inventive horror films from the 1960s that prove the decade wasn't just about Hitchcock and haunted houses. These films remind us that horror has always been more than jump scares and monsters. It's about what festers in the dark corners of the human mind. The fear of being seen, of being forgotten, of being alone in a world that's already ended. Which of these forgotten horrors have you seen? And which one are you daring to watch next? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next descent into cinematic darkness.